Greetings, Violet, and welcome to my first ever painting tutorial. And today we're starting off strong because we're painting a Plague Marine. These models are so much fun to paint. Chaos is fun to paint in general. They have so much trim, so much character and personality, which I know is quite an enticing thing for a lot of new players. So I figured I'd start off strong. And today we're painting one of my Kill Team members, primarily for Kill Team 2nd Edition, and it's the Plague Marine Fighter with Plague Knives and Bolt Pistol. The body I use comes from the Chaos Space Marine box set, which is unfortunately discontinued, but you can still find these pieces available in the Chaos Space Marine Combat Patrol. And the arms and one of the shoulder pads comes from the Plague Marines box set, and the head comes from the Mad Clown Head set from Puppets Ward. Now, I'm pretty sure you're asking yourself why I specifically chose this head. Well, that's just the thing, Varlets. Followers of Nurgle are said to be jolly and full of cheer, happily spreading plague wherever they go. But the Death Guard minis just never seem to capture that aesthetic for me. So I bought these heads and I used them to spice up my Plague Marines and give them that joyful, if a bit psychotic, appearance. Something akin to Gelg's Posture Mage Sigmar. Whoa. Yeah, that is a face only a mother can love. But yeah, to start things off, we always prime our minis, so I primed them with the Chaos Black spray can from Citadel, which is my go-to for most of my minis. And the first paint we'll be using today is Nagaroth Knight. Now you're wondering, well, if it's supposed to be a Plague Marine, why are you starting with a purple base color? Well, I'm thinking that I really want some nice contrast in the deep recesses, and purple will look great as an undertone. And to apply this paint, I use my size 3 grabby paintbrush. As you can see here, we covered just about everything on the model except for some details such as the under armor, the belt, and the pouches, the trim, and the knives, to include his face. Now, why the face? Well, I wanted his skin to have a pallid and sickly appearance, and that purple undertone will help in achieving that effect. Here's where we'll actually start adding some green to the model. And the paint I use is, of course, Death Guard green. I remember that the idea is to leave the recesses of the model with that purple undertone, so do not slather the mini with green everywhere. This method will give us some nice hue changes from the purple, which should be the darkest parts of the model, to the green, which are exposed to the light. And to achieve this, I use a slightly smaller brush. I wanted to make sure I have great control of my brush strokes, so I use my size 1 grabby. Once we're done adding the Death Guard green, we'll be covering it with Agrax Earthshade, a wash type of paint that will collect in the recesses of the model and give the green a grimy appearance. For this, I use my size 7 grabby. We're not too worried about overspill since we'll be covering up the other parts with paint in due course. But we're not stopping here, Varlets. We need to go back and add some Death Guard green again to give the mini an appearance of brightening on the part which would be exposed to the light. Now the mini is starting to have some nice value changes from dark to light. He still has a grimy appearance, but it appears that the light is exposing the more reflective parts of the armor, thanks to this method. From here, we're going to continue to add brightness to the armor with Orc Flesh. As we add brighter colors to the armor, we'll be covering less and less surface area to make it really look like the armor is being exposed to light. For this step, I'll be using my size 1 Da Vinci brush. As you can see, I've avoided adding Orc Flesh to a lot of the body of the mini due to his posture. So I mostly covered the areas that for sure would be exposed to light. So we will be able to see a lot of the Orc Flesh on the arms, back, and sides, but very little of the chest, growing, and front of his legs. Now, having done this step, I lost some of the griminess on the model. So I went back and touched up the rim of the pauldrons and other spots where grime would collect in order to make sure to keep his grimy appearance. And for this step, I use a size 0 Da Vinci since I'm being very particular about where I'm adding the grime. Here you can see that we've regained some of that grimy appearance to the rim of the pauldrons and the edges of the armor where grime will realistically collect. And now we're completely done with painting the armor. So we'll now move on to a part that I will consider the most fun and yet most difficult of any miniature, the head. especially a helmetless head. And the first color I'm going to use is all grain camo. Remember that I want his skin to look sickly, so I chose this color for its yellowish green hue. Now, for painting faces, I always want to have the most brush control possible, so I use my size quintuple 0 Marie. Unfortunately, I still slathered on a bit too much, so I went back and added a wash to the skin by way of Druki Violet and my size 0 Da Vinci brush. I made sure my brush was very wet when getting that Druki Violet onto it, since I didn't want to lose all that yellowish green I had added onto the face. We're most definitely not done with the face just yet, Varlets. We need to start adding some highlights to that horrid face. And for this step, I use Krieg Khaki, still using that size quintuple 0 Marie. Once done, I added a brighter tone with deep-kin flesh. Now his skin is looking downright horrifying. So let's add to the horror by painting his eyes. Now, I usually prefer to paint eyes first, but I wanted to give his eyes an otherworldly glow. Something to signify that he's truly touched by the gifts of Nurgle. And the first color I used to make this effect was Warpstone Glow, while continuing to use my quintuple 0 Marie. When adding this color, make sure to water it down heavily. You want to have a similar consistency to a watercolor. I then smeared it on all across the eyes and the eye sockets. Now, having added the Warpstone Glow, I immediately begin to add moot green to the eyes, being extra careful with how I brush it onto the eyes. For this step, we only want this color on the eyes, no overspillage. Remember to tuck in those elbows for greater brush control. And to really emphasize the glow effect, I used a technical paint known as Tesseract Glow, an incredibly useful paint. Now he's really got that madman green glow in his eyes. But we're not stopping there. We need to add the finishing touch, which is a tiny pop of Ariel Yellow. And there you have it. He now has the power of Nurgle coursing through his veins. Now let's paint those teeth. To give him some ugly yellowish teeth, I apply Xandri dust with my quintuple 0 Marie. Now he's looking quite happy. Then I finished off the teeth with some highlights with Screaming Skull. And there we have it, Varlets. We have completed the face, eyes, and teeth. We will finally move on to the trim of his armor. And if you know what the Death Guard look like, then you'll know that they like their bronze and or copper trim. For this step, I applied Screaming Belt with my size 1 Da Vinci. Aside from the armor trim, I also painted the crossguard and the handle of the knives. But I avoided the chaos icon dangling from his waist since I'm painting the loincloth next and don't want to have to paint around it. And the first color I used for the loincloth is Galvorback Red, which I applied with my size 1 Grabby. Remember to be careful when painting the inner part of the loincloth. We don't want to mess up the nice transition from Naggaroth Knight to Death Guard Green on his inner thigh. Next up for the loincloth is Jokaido Orange. If you saw the live stream where I painted my first Death Guard Marine, you'll remember that I gave him an orange loincloth, and I want to make sure that this Marine matches my first one. They are in the same kill team after all, and for this step, I applied the paint with my size 1 Da Vinci. And since this bad boy needs his grime, I added Agrath Ursa to the loincloth too. For this step, I use my size 1 Grabby since I don't have to be too careful with the placement of this wash. Once the wash dried on the loincloth, I went back and painted on some highlights with Jokaido Orange with my size 1 Da Vinci. Since the loincloth is getting lost in his legs, I didn't have to spend too much time on this step. I just added a little bit on the raised edges. And I finished off the loincloth with a highlight of Fire Dragon Bright. What do you Varlets think? Do you like the orange with the green, or do you prefer the standard purple? Continuing with the metallics on the model, we'll begin by adding Lead Belcher to the trim on his chest, the tubing on the backpack, the spikes on his right leg, and the blades of the plague knives themselves. Since there's a lot of finicky little parts, I'm using my size 1 DaVinci for this step. Once I completed those parts, I began to work on his belt and pouches, and the strap with the chaos icon. And for the base color, I again used Galvorback Red. Due to the positioning of the belt, I felt it necessary to use a brush that would give me a lot of control. So I used my size 1 DaVinci. While painting the belt, I realized that the knives were going to be a problem. So I turned the model upside down in my hand. Paint handles like this one from Citadel are very useful for maintaining a good control of your miniature while painting. Now that I'm done with the base color for the belt, I can go back and paint the belt buckle with lead belcher and continue to use my size 1 DaVinci. And continuing with the small details like this one, I also painted the chaos icon hanging from his waist with Screaming Bell. Once done adding all the base metallics, I began adding some washes. Primarily Agrath Earthshade for everything covered with Screaming Bell and Seraphim Sepia for everything covered in lead belcher. I specifically used Seraphim Sepia in order to give all these iron/steel parts on the Mini a rusted appearance, which I applied with my size 1 Grabby. Next up, we'll be adding detail to all that leather. Since I used Galvorback Red to give the leather a maroon appearance, to contrast well with the green, I used my size 2 Grabby to apply Druchii Violet as a shader. Once the Druchii Violet was dried up, I went back over some of the more exposed parts of the belt and accessories with Galvorback Red and my size 1 Grabby. And again, due to the fact that his body is leaning forward so heavily, I only edge highlighted those key parts which would reflect light. Once the base and shaders have been placed, I then began to add brightness to the accessories with Word Bearer's Red. And the brush I used was my size 1 DaVinci. As you can see, I added Word Bearer Red to all those folds and corners of the accessories, since they are the parts most conducive to catching the light. And to finish up the accessories, I then added Bugman's Glow as an extreme highlight, using my Quintuple Zero Marine. And that's it. We're done with all the leather accessories on the Plague Marine. By this point, I was getting a little bored with how the blades on those plague knives were looking, so I decided it's time to add some corrosion to them. As you can see, there's tons of pox marks on the blades, and even here and there on the armor. So I thought it'd be fun to make them stand out more by painting them Sotek green. Now for this step, I made sure to really water down the paint. We want a watercolor consistency for this one, just like we did earlier for the Warpstone green. And I used my size 1 DaVinci when applying the paint onto the model due to a need for control. We don't want this very bright color landing somewhere we don't want it to. Remember that these are plague knives, so it's only fitting that they stand out on the model to really showcase their sinister potential. I also added Sotek green to some of the rivets on the trim to show the oxidation of the metal. Please be sparse with this step. You don't want to go overboard and get it everywhere. Less is more here. Okay, he's looking proper deadly now, but I want these blades looking extra poisonous. So I began repeating the steps I took for the eyes, but this time to the edges of the blades. So I watered down some Warpstone Glow again and applied the paint to the edges of the blade with my size 1 Grabby. Don't worry too much about overspillage, since the point of this step is to make it look like it's glowing. I also added Warpstone Glow to that posh looking thing on the sword in his right hand. That's going to glow as well. And now that I think about it, actually that's a knife, not a sword, but it might as well be a sword with how big it is. A normal human carrying this would definitely call this a sword. And mind you that I need a thicker consistency of Warpstone Glow for the posture to make sure that it's fully covered. And now, to build up the effect, I painted on some moot green with my size 1 DaVinci, being extra careful with where I painted. And as the brightest part of the effect, I used Aerial Yellow as an extreme highlight. I applied the paint with my Quintuple Zero Marie for extreme control in my brushstrokes. And as the pièce de résistance, I used my size 2 Grabby to smear Tesseract Glow all over the edges of the blades. Loving how the effect makes these blades pop. Now we have to edge highlight all the metal bits painted over with lead belcher. And for this step, I used Stormhold Silver along with my Quintuple Zero Marie. And that does it for all the iron/steel parts of the Mini. I then followed up with adding the base color to the spikes coming out of his left shoulder and the tiny spikes coming out of his power pack. The paint I used for this step was Mornfang Brown, and I applied it with my size 1 Grabby. Continuing on with the bone protrusions, I used my size 1 Da Vinci to apply Xanadu dust. I made sure the paint was watered down a bit since we want a nice transition from the Mornfang brown to the Xanadu dust. And then to finish with the bones, I stayed using the same brush and painted on some Screaming Skull. And there we have it. The bones are complete and have that nice gradient effect of dark to light color. Next up, we'll be painting on the highlights to all the parts painted with Screaming Bell, and to do that, I used full grade copper and applied it with my quintuple zero Marie. Now we can see some nice detailing on the trim. I just love edge highlighting. It really makes the minis pop. I also made sure to add some full grade copper to the areas of the trim that would be more reflective, such as the upper parts of the pauldron there. If you notice Varlets, he's got some nasty looking slugs crawling out of his power pack. So we're going to start making some headway on those. I also thought it'd be fun to make it seem like that stud on his chest piece there looks like one of those creepy crawlies, but coming out of his chest. And to start off, I used Screamer Pink and applied it with my size 1 Grabby. Then I added some YouTube Varlet as a wash all over the slugs, continuing to use the very same brush. Having added the base color and the wash, I began building on the look with some highlights of Cacophony Purple and my size 1 Da Vinci. Unfortunately, I went a little heavy with the Cacophony Purple, so I had to go back with some Druki Varlet and my size 1 Grabby. Alright, now it's looking nice and clean. Or at least as clean as a disgusting larva goes. Next up is the slime. As you can see, he's got some slime coming out of the vents of his power pack, so we're going to paint those using the same technique we've done so far with the eyes and blades. You should be familiar with this technique by now, so here's how he turned out. Very happy with how he's looking. Next up is the hair. Now, one thing I've been wanting to do with the model is give him blonde hair. Now, this is something that I felt would be difficult, seeing as blonde hair might be drowned out by his yellowish skin, but I think I figured out a way to still make the hair readable. And the color which I use as the base for this idea is Steel Legion Drab. I applied the color using my size 2 Grabby. All the disease surrounding this character would remove any vibrancy his hair would have. So I figured if I use this color, I might give the blonde a suitably decayed appearance. I then built up on the base color with some Baylor Brown, using my size 0 Da Vinci. Beginning with the highlights, I added on some Ungor Flesh and switched up to my quintuple zero Marie. And for an extreme highlight, I used the same brush to add some Screaming Skull in the key bends and folds of the hair to make it seem like the light is being caught by those edges of hair, similar to how hair actually reacts to light. Now he's looking fabulous. Alright, with his hair complete, we can now start with the base. And I'll be honest, Varlets, I hate doing bases. It's the least interesting part of my journey whenever painting a model. I wish I had bases with terrain already built into it, so I wouldn't have to touch them too much other than to add paint. But because I don't, I'll have to get creative. So I started with my trusty Strickland Mud, a technical paint with a lot of texture already built into it. It makes it easy to create the illusion of dirt and rocks at his feet. And since it's a whole lot of canvas to cover, I use my size 7 Grabby. Keep in mind that this type of paint usually takes a while to dry, so you should wait a while before adding more paint on top of it. Once it's dry and it has the right texture you're looking for, it's time to add a wash to give it the appearance of depth and lighting. For this step, I use Agrath Earthshade and my size 3 Grabby. Once the wash dried up, we add highlights to the base color, which I did by using some Mornfang Brown. Unfortunately, I didn't pack my dry brush from Citadel, so I used my size 3 Grabby. Do not try this with a regular brush unless it has already received a lot of punishment and it has already begun to fray. You will definitely lose the fine point of the brush by using it as a dry brush. And I finished off the dry brushing with some Carrick Stone as an extreme highlight. Keep in mind that this step will probably go a lot more smooth with a dry brush. And there we go, the ground on the base is complete. But unfortunately, we're not done with the base. If you notice, he has a tiny tactical rock he's standing on and a skull aesthetically placed right next to it. So let's paint that, shall we? And as the base color, I started off with the very same paint we used for that extreme highlight on the base itself, Carrick Stone. And since I'd prefer to have a brush with better control, I used my size 2 grabby. I then again used some Agrath Earthshade as a wash on the stone, still using the same brush. Now, I avoided adding Agrath Earthshade on the skull since I've already found the perfect wash for skulls, Seraphim Sepia. And now we can see a good differentiation between the stone and the skull. We don't want them blending together too much. I then used my size 1 grabby to go back and reapply Carrick Stone to these 2 elements, focusing on the edges. Now, to complete the base, I edge highlighted the skull, gingerly applying some Screaming Skull with my size 1 grabby. We're so close to being done, Varlets. We just have some tiny details that I forgot to go over. First of all, his grenade. If you look closely, you'll see that little guy hidden on his left hip between his arm and power pack. Now, I can't just make it green like the rest of his armor. It'll just blend with the armor too much. So I went with another well-known color for grenades, bluish gray. And to represent this, I used the Fang as my base color and applied it with my size 1 grabby. Once dry, I gave it a highlight of Fenrisian gray using my size 0 Da Vinci. And for the final bit of detail, the under armor. I'll be honest, Varlets, I nearly forgot to do this step at all. That's why it's near the end of the video and not somewhere near the beginning. Anyway, there's a lot of painstaking work already on the Mini, so I do not want to screw up this process. So I went with my smallest brush, my size quintuple 0 Marie, and began the process with Eshin Gray. I made sure to only add paint to the raised ribbing of the under armor, so as to not lose the black in those deep recesses. And to finish the Mini, I painted on some extreme highlights with Ceramite White. And now, without further ado, the completed Plague Marine Fighter with Plague Knives. This has been my most labor-intensive video to date, Varlets. A month's worth of painting during my very limited off hours while away from my studio, and a little over 2 weeks of video editing when I return. Hopefully you enjoy the fruits of my labor. Let me know what you Varlets think in the comments below. And before we go, here is a list of all the paints and brushes I used for this model for easy reference. I have been Interrogator Rosario Rimas, attaché to Inquisitor Markham of the Order Hereticus, and I'm signing out from the grim dark future. Bye-bye, Varlets, and may the machine god bless all your painting endeavors. Hey, if you like what you heard, then please feel free to say so in the comments, or hit me up on Instagram at RosarioUSArt. And don't forget that I stream every week on Twitch, which is also at RosarioUSArt. Come join the fun.